Hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to Now New York's Activist Power Hour. Today, I'm so very excited about the discussion we're about to have. We're also involved and so much looking forward to the upcoming election on November 3rd, where we will be grabbing Trump by the ballot. And today, we have the privilege of talking with one of the most exciting reporters out on the scene in politics today. Charlotte Alter is a correspondent with Time magazine. She writes about politics, and she has spent a lot of time out on the campaign trail with some of the up-and-coming millennial candidates who've been elected to office. So feel free to ask her about her time out on the campaign trail with them. And she has just released a book that is called The Ones We've Been Waiting For, How a New Generation of Leaders Will Transform America. So welcome, Charlotte. Thank you so much for taking time out of your super busy schedule now, promoting your book and covering politics. As you said, each and every day, something new happens that you've got to respond to.
Yeah, well, Sonia, thank you so much for having me here. I love Now. I'm so excited to see one of the attendees read the book for her book club, which is so exciting. So I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Let's start by talking about the premise of your book. We know that in 2018, the number of millennials who were elected to office or in office jumped fivefold, from 5 to 26. That's pretty incredible. And I believe that you were telling me that if it was proportional to the number of living millennials, there should be close to 100 people who are millennials who are in Congress. So tell us a little bit about how you see millennials, what has shaped them, and further, how do you see them transforming America? How will they lead?
So that's a great question. So basically, I started working on this book. I started thinking about this on the day that Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, because, and that was in May of 2017, May or June of 2017. And when that happened, I saw a 71-year-old man who was the oldest first-term president ever elected, surrounded by old men, encouraged by old men to unilaterally take this action that would disproportionately affect the younger people who are going to inherit the planet. And as soon as I began, and it seemed to me like sort of the opening shot in a generational war, the idea that the older people in their 70s and 80s who were still clinging to power in Washington seemed to have really no regard for the kind of planet that they were leaving people my age. So as soon as I started to see this in a generational context, I began to realize that so many of the things that Trump was doing actually had a generational sort of edge to them. When he cancels DACA, that doesn't just affect immigrants, it actually specifically affects young immigrants who were, students who had been admitted under Obama's program. When he bans trans people from the military, that's not really something that, there aren't a lot of trans service members in their 50s and 60s and 70s. That's something that really affects people in their teens, 20s, and 30s. So the more I looked at it, the more it seemed like his presidency was increasingly becoming a cudgel for the old to use against the young. And I was thinking about, I didn't really want to write a manifesto. I didn't really want to start a generational war. But as I began to think about this, I began to notice that all across the country, there were all of these young people who were stepping up, who were kind of entering the political sphere. And they didn't really make the headlines because they were mayors of small cities, or they were on, city councils or state legislatures, and maybe they were just beginning to run for Congress. So I kind of decided to go and talk to as many of those young people as I could find and try to get a sense of, what they believed and why they believed that, and sort of what kind of attitudes and assumptions and ideas they were going to bring into the political realm when they inevitably do rise in numbers. Because again, what we're talking about here is a biological fact, right? Nobody can stay around forever. We have people in Congress and in the Senate right now who were born in the 1930s. Those people are not going to still be in the Senate in the 2050s. And so in order to get a sense of what our national leadership is going to look like as we get deeper into the 21st century, I tried to basically talk to as many of the sort of rising generation as I could to get a sense of that.
That leads me to the question of, since you're ending on talking about the so many people in elected office who are in their 70s or 80s, why is that? And as we look to the future, I mean, yes, people hang on to power, but what are the systemic things in place that lean towards incumbency?
So the power of incumbency is really real. And, it's been true forever that once you get elected, it's much easier to get reelected than it is to, get elected for the first time. And that's why open seats are often considered to be big opportunities for young people or new people who hadn't been in power before. And that's partly because it's a lot easier to raise money when you are already in office. People are able, office holders are able to use their positions to build connections with donors. They have connections with the party. There are all these, people are much more likely to take a chance on somebody who's already won and served than somebody who they don't know. But for this generation in particular, two things kind of dovetailed to keep government so old right now. Actually, I think three things. One is that a lot of the people who are in power right now are baby boomers. And for many of them, I hope I am not offending anybody when I say this, but for many of particularly the people who are still in the Senate and still in Congress, there's this sense that it's still their time, that like it's still 1985 and not that much has changed. And they're still the people who are, most in touch with what's happening in the world. So I do think there's like a little bit of a psychological thing. But structurally, two things happened at once. One is that because of things like Citizens United, the decision that allowed unlimited campaign contributions, the price of running for office went way up. So running for a congressional seat in the 1980s, when many baby boomers were first running for Congress, that probably cost less than $100,000, right? Now, to run for a congressional seat, we saw people spending $4 million running for a congressional seat in 2018. So that's because of the crazy campaign, the crazy culture of campaign contributions that we have. So on the one hand, the cost of running for office goes up. On the other hand, the net worth of the youngest generation has gone way down. And that's partly because of things like student debt and the way the gig economy has disproportionately affected young people. But when you hear about millennials who can't afford to buy cars or buy homes or feel like they can't afford to start families, that's the same generation who also can't afford to take a chance and quit their job to raise hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars to run for office. And frankly, listen, if this is also, politics is also all about connections, right? So even if there was, one particular young person who felt like they could take that chance, they wouldn't necessarily know a lot of other rich young people who could help them fund their campaign. So that's one of the reasons why sort of the people who have been in power have really tended to stay there.
Right, and this goes to the heart of what we're talking about. How will millennials wield their power, and also what shaped them? Because it's every single day, and it's so tied to our standing as a world-class country and our prospects for the future. I mean, the statistics do not lie, and they are alarming how today's younger people, the millennials, just do not have the foot up, as some of the things that you just described, that our parents did. Actually, right now, young people graduating from college or not, cannot expect to do better than their parents. And that has always been the engine that drove American prosperity and hope and culture. And that just isn't there now. You mentioned student debt. A lot started happening with change. 9/11 was a real wake-up call and shook this country to the core about our exceptionalism, about just being insular in terms of our viewpoints, not in terms of our government interaction, involvement with other countries. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you just hit the nail right on the head. So I feel like you asked this in your first question, then I kind of got off on a little bit of a tangent. So I'm sorry about that. But so here's what I found in writing this book. One of the things that I found was that just like your childhood experiences in your family inform your adult psychology, the same is true on a broader generational level. So the major historical events of young adulthood, roughly between when young people are maybe like 14 to 26 or 28, those events shape lifelong political leanings much more than things that you would experience in your 40s or 50s. And that's partly because it's kind of like, that age period is the first time that many young people are beginning to pay attention to politics, they're beginning to pay attention to the world around them, and they're beginning to form their political identity. So what I did in this book is I looked at the major historical events of that period of time for millennials. So the book starts at 9/11, which was absolutely a pivotal moment for this generation that shaped how they see America in the world. It goes through the Iraq wars, which seriously dented millennials' sense of American exceptionalism and faith in foreign policy, in the foreign policy establishment in particular. That's why these endless wars, which by the way were fought by millennials. Young people are the ones who enlisted to go over to Iraq and Afghanistan. The sort of disasters of those wars have led many millennials to kind of be like, why are we engaging in these foreign wars? Why do we care about regime change? Like, we have hungry kids here in the United States who don't have clean water to drink. Like, why are we sticking our nose in other countries' business? Like, let's focus on getting our own stuff done. So the Iraq War through the financial crisis, which absolutely decimated the financial and economic outlook for many millennials, because a lot of people graduated into the financial crisis. Their careers have been defined by the kind of precariousness that the financial crisis created. Into Barack Obama's campaign and presidency, which was a real political moment, a transformational political moment for a lot of young people, where it really changed how campaigns are run and how young people and what young people expect from their leaders. And the book ends sort of with the Trump presidency, which for many of these millennials was kind of the kick in the rear that they needed a little bit. They had been forming their political identity through 9/11 and Iraq and the financial crisis and Obama. And then Trump was, for many young people, the moment where they were like, you know what, if this guy can get elected president of the United States, I can get elected to my state legislature. I can get elected to Congress. I can, be on my school board. And that's why, as you said earlier, that's why millennial representation has increased so much in the last couple of years, because a lot of millennials are sort of realizing that the people in power are not going to create the solutions to the problems that they want to see. And I think a lot of young people are coming to the conclusion that 20th century leaders are not going to be able to solve 21st century problems, and that they need to be growing 21st century leaders to address those.
So interesting. Thank you for putting that into perspective. It's really enlightening. I can't help but think when you're talking about, there was another group of people that we spoke about in the same way you're talking about millennials. The being inspired, finally getting their day, being able to change the world, and that's women. And I've now lived through, I think, at least a couple of reiterations of the Year of the Woman. Mm-hmm. So have millennials passed up women as a class? Or maybe you want to talk about the intersection of women in politics and millennials. And by the way, we should mention for everybody that millennials are folks that were born in the early 80s, to 2000 or so. So it's basically adults 40 and under.
Yeah, roughly, exactly. So a lot of people think of millennials as like teens on TikTok. That's actually Gen Z. Millennials are people who are maybe like roughly 25 to 40 right now. So Sonia, that is a fantastic question. And it's one of the things that I actually focused on really specifically in my book, because many of the, there is a huge overlap, because many of the women who flipped key seats and created this incredible momentum in 2018 were millennials. And many of the millennials who are sort of most, whose ascendance has been most important to this generation's political identity are women. So AOC is a great example of this. She's somebody who has really become the leader of the de facto leader of the progressive movement in this country right now. But also the majority makers, the people who flipped seats in 2018 and helped give Nancy Pelosi the gavel in the House again, people like Haley Stevens, Lauren Underwood, Sharice Davids, Abby Finkenauer, all of those young women are millennials. And they are part of this, both a rise of women and also a rise of this kind of new generation. And one of the things that I talk about in the book, which I think gets exactly to this point, is that after Obama was elected in 2018, young Black men across the country began to see themselves reflected in the White House and began to consider their own political futures. And in cities like Stockton, California, and Ithaca, New York, and Birmingham, Alabama, and Little Rock, Arkansas, and Charlotte, North Carolina, young Black men kind of stepped up to emulate Barack Obama. And I think what happened in 2016 is that young women saw Hillary Clinton run for president, saw her win 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, saw what happened in 2016. I don't need to explain that to any of you. And for a lot of young women, that was their kick that they needed, in the same way that Obama's ascendance had been the kick for for many of these young Black men, who now, by the way, are running cities all across the country. Montgomery, Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, Little Rock, I listed a bunch of them already. So I think that you're totally right that I wrote a Time cover story called The Avengers, and it was about all these women who were women of all ages who were running for office to kind of avenge Hillary Clinton's loss and assert their, take back this idea that women don't belong in politics and assert the importance of women's issues and women's power. And young women are a really important part of that. They're not the only part of that, they're an important part of that.
Well, I love the way that you helped actually not create divisiveness between the generations by pointing out that many of these young women who were elected actually helped give Nancy Pelosi the gavel again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And
boy, has she given Donald Trump a run for his money. I mean, it really, some of the older women in this country now. It's just, it's really inspiring the way that they are meeting Nancy Pelosi to Sonia Sotomayor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and plenty of the others that I'm forgetting at this moment. But thanks for pointing that out. That's a great way to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for example, networks like Indivisible, right? Which I don't know if you all know about Indivisible, but it was it is one of the most effective grassroots groups that really helped bring Democrats into power in 2018. It's sort of modeled after the Tea Party. So, but most of Indivisible is made up of women in their 50s and 60s living in suburban, largely white areas, swing districts, who kind of just got fed up with Donald Trump and were sick of only voting and decided that they needed to be more proactive about their activism. And so they started these local Indivisible groups that would have bake sales, and they would, write postcards, and they would make phone calls, and they would show up to their congressman's office. And then once a candidate emerged to challenge a sitting Republican, they would rally around that person. So I think this is actually a really good example of the intersection between different generations, because this movement was made up mostly of middle-aged and older women, but it was started by young people. The two people, it was started by a married couple, Ezra Levin and Leah Greenberg, who were former congressional staffers who worked in Congress during the Tea Party surge. So they were the people picking up the phone when the Tea Partiers would call Congress to yell about the Affordable Care Act. So they knew how to pressure Congress. They knew what worked and what didn't. They knew what a congressman cares about and what he doesn't. And they were the ones who said, hey, listen, don't call Jeff Flake if you don't live in Arizona. He doesn't want to hear from you. Like, don't call Chuck Schumer if you don't live in New York. He doesn't want to hear from you. Don't call a representative if you don't live in their district. Like, here, do this, don't do that. So I think there's been this really interesting merging of sort of new disruptive techniques that have been pioneered by a lot of these millennials, and then this army of women of all ages who just want to kind of make the country better and get rid of Donald Trump.
Well, we can certainly attest to that at the National Organization for Women. We really have that generational, multiple generations who are coming to the tables, and it's always inspiring. When we get on a bus to go campaign and canvass for someone, it's pretty inspiring to see women who are in their 70s or older with their cane being there at 6 a.m. to get on the bus.
Yeah.
They know what's at stake as well, and they're fierce. So what's interesting about millennials winning, though, is that they're not all progressive, which is mostly what we've been talking about now. Tell us what's happening on the Republican side. Are we seeing the same kind of thing? It's interesting here in New York, we have Elise Stefanik, which we all saw when she during, which testimony was that she really laid into somebody? I can't remember, but we all.
It was impeachment.
It was the impeachment. Yes.
Yeah.
There's been so many scandals. It's hard to keep track of them all.
Yeah.
So, and then Dan Crenshaw, I believe, was a bet. Tell us a little bit about what's happening on the Republican side.
So one of the things, so I want to get back to a question you asked me earlier, but I didn't quite answer, which feeds into this one, which is kind of what do these millennials have in common? And on the left, among liberals and Democrats, things they have in common are millennials really want aggressive action on climate change. They really want a solution to healthcare. A lot of millennials support Medicare for all. They want solutions on immigration. They believe in racial justice. One of the things that I noticed that was really interesting is that there are a lot of is that young Democrats and young Republicans tend to agree with each other on what the problems are, what the most pressing problems are. They just still disagree on what the solutions are. So for example, young Republicans understand the science of climate change and know that we have to do something about it. You don't see a lot of Republicans saying, a lot of young Republicans and young conservatives saying, climate change isn't real. We don't, it's not caused by humans. There's nothing to do about it. Where there's disagreement between young Democrats and young Republicans is what that solution will be. Will it be a big green jobs program like a Green New Deal, which is what I think a lot of young Democrats want? Will it be a more sort of business-oriented carbon tax type of approach, which is, I think, what a lot of young conservatives want? Immigration is another issue where, with some big exceptions, on the left and the right, there is among young people, there is a general idea that there should be a path to citizenship for young immigrants. And how do we do that? And how do we also protect American jobs? Another issue is racial justice. Younger conservatives are much more likely than older conservatives to say racism is real, structural racism is real. Black Americans are disproportionately harmed by police. What do we do about it? And I think that there's still disagreement about what that solution is, but young conservatives are not still in denial about a lot of these things. Marriage equality is another place where young conservatives are kind of like, that ship has sailed. Want to get married? Great, not a problem. Sure, let's stop fighting about it. One area where there has not been a lot of generational movement is abortion. Young conservatives are still extremely against reproductive rights and against abortion rights. And it's one of the main things that is like drawing young people into the conservative movement and into the Republican Party is opposition to abortion. So that's one big place where there hasn't been a lot of generational movement. But I think the way to think about it is that it's like taking dishes from the back burner onto the front burner. The previous generation had a lot of these issues like the environment and racial justice and immigration and marriage equality that were kind of on the back burner. They were focused on jobs, they were focused on foreign wars, they were focused on taxes. And millennials of both parties are taking a lot of those issues and bringing them to the front burner and saying, these are the problems that we're going to deal with. We're going to disagree on what the right solutions are. We're going to bicker about it. It's going to take us many years to figure out the right path forward on climate change. But unlike the previous generation, we're not going to sit around and say, this isn't a problem, this doesn't exist, we don't care. So I think that that's kind of, it's not that they totally agree with each other on the politics or the policy even, but they do have a common sense of what the priorities are.
Thank you so much. Which makes me think, so Gen X, and actually there was something in the chat, there's a bench now of Gen Xers who are coming along. What do you think the value gap is between Gen Xers and is it Gen Ys? I'm not sure.
Oh, so Gen X is older than millennials, and then Gen Z. I think millennials are technically Gen Y, but Gen X is like people who are between 40 and 55, and Gen Z are the people who are teens now. So, okay. So and it's funny, people ask me a lot about Gen X, but they're kind of like, why didn't you write a book about Gen X? And I'm like, because I wrote a book about millennials. Yeah. Gen X is a little bit, because they're between millennials and baby boomers, they're a little bit kind of caught between. And in fact, a lot of the people who are very much in our national conversation right now, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, on the right, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton, those are all Gen Xers. And not certainly, but I definitely think there's going to be a Gen X president before there's a millennial president. I mean, there's a lot of great talent in that generation. I think one of the big things that is different, and I explore this in my book, is that the internet is in a lot of ways like a dividing line. So millennials are the oldest digital natives, the oldest people who really kind of grew up with the internet as their first language, and also the youngest generation to remember what life was like before the internet. So millennials still remember when you had to call someone on the phone and ask, talk to the mom before you get to the kid, and you had to go to the library to do your homework. A lot of millennials still remember that world. They were kids and teenagers when that happened. Gen Z, the teens right now, never remembered a world before the internet. So I think Gen Xers are a little bit more in the realm of the boomers, or in the gravitational orbit of the boomers, because they're still kind of the pre-digital world. And studies are showing that Gen Z, the kids who are teens right now, are much more aligned with the millennials. They care about the same issues. They are concerned with the same things. They're actually like more to the left of millennials on a lot of things. They're more radical, maybe because they're younger.
And they're more involved in politics. I mean,
they're
activism that's taking place because of technology.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be super interesting.
It's going to be super interesting. Yeah.
I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure to get to some of the great questions that we have.
Sure.
We have a few more minutes. I have a question from Gabrielle in Queens. Is there a confidence gap among voters of different age groups when it comes to supporting younger political figures?
That's a great point. A great question. One thing that I actually found that surprised me was that it's not as simple as like young voters like young candidates and old voters like old candidates. In fact, it is sometimes, particularly in this presidential election, it was basically the opposite, because the youngest voters loved Bernie Sanders, who's I think older than Joe Biden. So he was the oldest candidate running for president, and he solidly carried young voters by an enormous margin. It was not even a question. And the youngest candidate, Pete Buttigieg, actually did pretty well with older voters. And in South Bend in particular, he also is like very popular with older populations in South Bend. So one of the things that I learned in kind of talking to people about this and their reasoning behind this was that the experience of aging is something that only older people understand. Younger people don't understand aging because they haven't lived it. So I heard a lot more reservations from older people about Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders' age than I did from younger people, because older people would say, the gist of it would be, I'm 65 and I have a hard time finding my car keys. Why, how could somebody who's 15 years older than me run the free world? I'm slowing down. I can't chase after my grandkids anymore. I just turned 69. How is it that we're giving the nuclear codes to somebody who is even 10 years older than me? And so I think a lot of older voters actually like the idea of a younger candidate because they understand how age affects your sort of quickness and your strength and your mental acuity, and not for everybody, but they extrapolate something there. And I think that younger voters don't understand that and tend to be a little bit more like, well, here's what I care about. This is his policy. Great, do it. And don't really think of age as, one other aspect of that. The other reason that I think Bernie Sanders' age actually worked in his favor with a lot of younger voters is that he had a record of consistency. So when he talked about something like Medicare for all, or he talked about something like the environment, younger voters could see that he had been talking about that exact issue in the exact same way for 40 years. So they trusted it. Unlike, for example, somebody who maybe was new to the scene and just started talking about it, and they might be on the same page this year, but maybe in 5 years they'll be singing a different tune. A lot of millennials are really skeptical of being kind of manipulated in that way. So Bernie Sanders, the fact that he was so old, yet he had been so consistent on a lot of these things, really worked in his favor with them.
Really counterintuitive, but so interesting, and it actually makes sense when you think about it. I've got 3 questions that I want to get to before we end. 2 of them are, one's going to be quick, but 2 are maybe a little meatier. So maybe hopefully we can try to get through them.
Yeah.
We're living through an unprecedented pandemic that is starkly highlighting economic and racial disparities. We're seeing sustained protests because of the murder of George Floyd. How is Black Lives Matter, how is that movement shaping political engagement, and how do you think it will impact the future?
It's a great question. I mean, Black Lives Matter has been tremendously impactful even in the last couple months. I think there's a real argument to be made that Eliot Engel lost his seat partly because of Black Lives Matter. Jamal Bowman is a young middle school principal who unseated Eliot Engel, who had been in Congress for like 35 years or something. That's partly because he ran a great campaign and Eliot Engel was kind of missing in action, but also Jamal Bowman was really of the movement. He was a young Black man who could talk authentically about police violence. He understood this issue. He had worked in the school system and had seen students struggling with this. He was somebody who could be an authentic voice on this. And so I covered the protests in New York, and there were so much of the protests were about voting, making calls on behalf of Jamal Bowman or Mondaire Jones, voting in your districts, voting for people who represented the values of this movement. But I also think more broadly, it's really hard with these movements to say like, this movement happened and then this person was elected, like done. The way these movements work is that it's about kind of changing minds and changing national attitudes. And that's one of the things, and I actually wish I had the numbers in front of me, but it's one of the things that has been most striking about Black Lives Matter is that in the last 7 years since Trayvon Martin was killed, the number of white Americans it used to be that 3/4 of Americans didn't think systemic racism was a thing, didn't really think that police, targeted Black communities, and 1/4 of Americans thought systemic racism was real and thought that police treated Black people unfairly. Now it's flipped. 3/4 believe that systemic racism is real, understand the realities of police violence, and only 1/4 doesn't see it. So I think that that's how we can measure these things. It's not so much in terms of like, this protest got this many votes, and more in terms of how have these movements shaped the way the American public is thinking about these issues.
Okay, great. Check the time here. So we have a question about Me Too, which had so much momentum, but maybe somewhat overshadowed by more recent crises. Intersectionality is at the heart of millennial movements. How are women's rights and racial justice intersecting and coming together?
That's a great question. So one of the things that I think is one of the strengths of the way millennials build political power is this idea of intersectionality, that it's not just about one thing, and that different communities have overlapping identities. You can be a Black woman, you can be a woman who is an immigrant, you can be a woman who lives in a polluted area, and therefore the environment is something that's really important to you. So I think that Me Too was an example of that sort of like collective action and collective power of like many voices of many women speaking at once. And I think that there continues to be, in fact, one of the things that I have found really interesting in covering a lot of these social movements, particularly Black Lives Matter, the newly ascendant progressive movement, and also the movement for a Green New Deal, the Sunrise Movement, is that a lot of the leaders of those movements are women. The 3 women started the hashtag Black Lives Matter. The person who is the most responsible for linking the Black Lives Matter movement with electoral politics. Her name is Jessica Bird. She's a woman. The movement to save immigrants, families belong together. That was a movement that was started by women. The executive director of the Sunrise Movement is a woman. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is the new leader of the progressive left. So I think that that's one of the things that has happened with the women's movement is that a lot of movements for other issues are now being led and championed by women, and women are really in the seat of power on a lot of those different pushes. So I think that it raises a lot of interesting questions of like, if women are running a lot of the activism that's happening right now, what does that mean for, a movement that is specifically about women? I don't know. It seems like things are kind of metastasizing and sort of like bleeding into each other, which I think is kind of what the progressives want, because I think that there's a real argument that you can't talk about immigration without talking about race, and you can't talk about sexual violence without talking about gender, and you can't talk about gender without talking about race.
Quickly, let me just ask you about Black women millennials. I have a question from Abby Dobson, president of Now NYC.
Oh, great.
Can you quickly characterize the level of political engagement of Black women millennials compared to Black men, white women, white men, whatever the case may be? Is there anything in particular that you found about Black women millennials?
So Black women millennials are incredibly politically engaged right now. And particularly Black women broadly, not just millennials, but Black women, even particularly older Black women, are the backbone of the Democratic Party and are the most reliable and loyal Democratic voters. Younger Black women are taking on that mantle and also adding to it. I think that a lot of the most interesting and frankly powerful activism has been coming from Black women millennials, and particularly in the aftermath of the racial justice movements over the last couple months, weeks and months. Black women millennials have really come to the forefront in terms of demanding that their leaders commit to a vision of racial justice that goes beyond platitudes and goes beyond like holding a sign. So I think that that's one of the ways in which Black women millennials have been super central to the way that the political climate has changed even over the last couple months.
Thank you so much. So tell us, who do you think, which VP candidate that's out there do you think will be most effective in galvanizing voters and being the right pick for Joe Biden? And a name alone will be fine if we don't have time to explain it, but we'd love to know what you've been thinking.
So unfortunately, I don't know that I can answer this question because of my job, but I do think, one thing to think about, I think, is that sometimes I think that people are thinking about this slightly the wrong way. They're asking like, who will mobilize the base, when actually the base is already very, very mobilized for Joe Biden. I think the Biden campaign is looking at this not like who will mobilize the base, but who will not lose, who like they want to avoid a Sarah Palin situation. So like who is like solidly, not gonna create problems in the last 4 months of this race, and who can be president when and if 77-year-old Joe Biden is not able to be. So I think it's, I don't know that there are that many Democrats who are saying to themselves, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden unless he picks this person as his VP nominee. I think people who are really engaged with the VP process and really care about this are probably already voting for Joe Biden no matter who he picks. So that's just like one thing. I sort of think that people are overthinking it a little bit. Like he's gonna pick the person that he thinks can be president. He's not gonna pick the person that he thinks is gonna appeal to this like narrow, to these voters or that voters or those voters. but I don't know who that person is. I wish I did.
Yes. I want to give a shout out to Ethel Gutenberg. She says, I'm 83 and don't care about age. I care about empathy and political ideas.
Great.
I'm with you, Ethel. Thank you so much for your comment. And Charlotte, thank you so much. This has been so interesting, so much to think about, so much to digest. I know my team's we're going to totally get into this. For everybody, thank you for joining us. I hope that you want to learn more about Charlotte's work out on the campaign trail. There were still so many questions that we didn't get to. So buy her book and make sure to be back next Wednesday. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague who's going to tell you a little bit about what we've got coming up. Reproductive rights, really important issue right now, lots going on. We are working around the clock to grab Trump by the ballot. So check out our website so you can learn all the things. We're going to give you the tools to make sure that you can do the phone banking and the canvassing and having those tough conversations with people in your lives. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Stay in touch with us. Charlotte, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Jean.
Thank you so much for having me, Sonia. I'm going to go, but thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. That was just a really fascinating and insightful conversation. I think that some of the takeaways that I had was that there's a common thread that exists across generations, and that is that political engagement is up. And we see that at the national organization every day, that women of every age are really engaging in politics in a new way. And I think that one of the things that Charlotte mentioned about that's so critical that millennials have really brought to the forefront is that it is so critical that we think about the intersections of race and gender and LGBTQ rights and immigrant rights. And we find ways to make sure that we look at how we can approach these issues in a broader way so that we don't leave people behind and that we really can achieve true equality. And I think the other point I just want to make as I get into some of the actions that we're going to ask you to take in the coming week is that it's really vital that all these movements, including Black Lives Matter, it's so critical to see how they are linking political power to ending voter suppression and getting out and voting. Right now, we're really at a critical point, and that's why our organization has been really committing our time and energy into doing whatever we can to educate people and vote Trump out in November, because I think we all understand that this is a monumental moment for our country. And it is very true what Charlotte says, and this is something that we've been commenting on since the midterms, when a historic number of women ran for Congress and won, and we now have the most women in Congress in history. I think that we have seen that behind the doors, at the forefront of every movement, every Indivisible group, politically active groups across the country that have been in touch with us and in New York, it's really women who have taken this mantle and led the way in the postcard writing and engaging in politics in a new way and starting these movements that it does take time for a movement to have an impact. And we see that with Black Lives Matter, starting right after the murder of Eric Garner here in New York City. But now that movement has continued to build and is actually shifting culture and shifting our country's value system and the way that a majority of people look at and understand race in this country. So it is very heartening to have a conversation like this with all that is difficult and hard that's happening right now. So I appreciate that. But more than ever, I think, and I'll ask Shannon to put up, yes, perfect timing, Shannon, I didn't even have to say it, put up our action slide, because it's more important than ever that that women and all people really come together to avenge our power, as Charlotte Alter mentioned. Just today, just moments before, as we were preparing for this event online, the Supreme Court issued a decision that will protect employers who basically say that they have a religious or moral objection to birth control, and it will allow them to deny birth control insurance coverage for their employees. And basically what this decision is saying is that the beliefs, the political or quote unquote moral beliefs of one boss is more important than the essential health care for potentially thousands of employees. And so although we've had some heartening Supreme Court decisions in the past week or two, I think that this is something that we also were anticipating, that we're going to see more cases in the pipeline that are quite harmful, in particular to women and in particular to reproductive health in our country. And so I think that we're just digesting this now, but I think that we are going to have to figure out a congressional fix to this ruling. It's one thing to uphold people's own individual religious freedoms, but it's quite another to pit those religious freedoms and just your own personal moral beliefs, which I think is a bar that is low, that we haven't seen before. To say that somebody just happens to not believe in birth control, and so none of their employees should have access to birth control. And of course, we know that this is going to harm disproportionately low-income women, young women, people of color the most. And so it is something that we're going to watch. And just as a reminder, some of our actions are the same each week and some of them are changing. But I think that we are all continuing, as we've learned through some of our political persuasion webinars that we've held, that we need to be reaching out to people. You never know who isn't registered to vote. So think about those people in your life. Make sure that you are laying the groundwork for them to be registered in time for this November election. I think the phone banking for candidates has taken a little bit of a pause, but we will be up and running again once candidates are really working now to challenge Republicans. So we have a couple of seats here in New York State that we have the opportunity to flip from red to blue, and some of them are getting a national spotlight. And so we're going to be working on those races, and we ask our Now New York members to join us in that work. And last, but certainly not least, something that I just want to put on people's radar that's coming up. So I think all of you have heard about the HEROES Act, and it includes it's sort of a second stimulus addressing the challenges of COVID-19 and addressing a whole host of issues, including making important changes to our federal elections, laying the groundwork to make sure that everyone can vote by mail. So there's a lot of good, meaty, important changes and proposals that are in the HEROES Act, and it did pass in the House, but it is sitting there in the Senate with nothing happening. And so I'm asking everyone to call their senators to support the HEROES Act. But in particular, there are some things that are not in that act right now that we think the Senate should be able to fix. And what that really involves is that there's no actual extra funding for culturally specific community organizations that serve domestic violence survivors or people experiencing sexual assault. And we know that this is especially critical when you're considering the disproportionate impact of violence on women of color and people of color. And we think that especially during this pandemic, where people are forced to stay at home, a home is not a safe place for everyone. And so domestic violence has been surging, and a lot of rape crisis organizations have their fundraisers in April during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so they're seeing a drop in their ability to fundraise to continue to serve survivors during this crisis, while they see a spike in calls from survivors because of the stress of the pandemic that they're experiencing, in addition to, increased domestic violence, and some of that violence including sexual assault. So I think that one thing that we can do in the next 9 days, there is a push across the country for people to call their senators, and we will send this information out to you following our webinar today. But we'll send out a script and more information about calling your senators to support the HEROES Act, but also to make sure that we make these critical additions to provide community-based organizations with the funds that they need to continue to serve survivors during this really difficult time. So I thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Shannon, my colleague, to wrap things up for the day, but I hope that you'll look for our email, you'll take action with us, And we look forward to working with all of you. Thank you so much.